Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a big approach.
So serious.
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Chasing the Gold. I'm Shadan Larkey. As you can see, I'm missing my co-host Erica today, but as I've mentioned on previous episodes, we're doing something kind of different and really exciting with Chasing the Gold, which is that we have assembled a team of amazing writers this year, and we've divided up all the Oscar categories. So it's sort of been my mission as we get closer and closer to the season to bring my writers on and introduce them and let them geek out about their respective categories. So, beloved special guests, tell the listeners who you are and what category we're going to be digging into today.
Hello, Shadan and everyone. I'm Zach Youngs. We are going to be talking about Best Picture today. It's one of my favorite categories, obviously the big one of the night. And so it's exciting to get to write about it and think about it for an entire year at least, and then move on to the next year.
Yeah. So, Zach, I have to start by asking you how you became a movie nerd and then how that movie nerd status transitioned into awards nerd / Oscar nerd. How did you end up here?
It's a strange road. We definitely saw a lot of movies when I was a kid. It was kind of one of our things. We would, summertime, we would just go to the movies, and I kind of got used to it. I kind of got used to the just being there and going to Blockbuster every week and seeing what the new releases were. And I think the interesting thing is, in the 90s when it was many more mainstream movies that were getting nominated, my folks and my sister were really into it. And so I got into it. And then like kind of once the sort of shift in the cultural status of movies being like more indie, more kind of the prestige shift, I stuck with it when they didn't. And so kind of that's where I fell in love with the idea of narratives and the idea of the big versus the small and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, I understand why Best Picture is exciting. I feel like Best Picture is exciting for everyone, but do you have a particular draw to that category? Is there a reason why that was sort of the category you wanted to cover for Chasing the Gold this year?
I suppose it's because it's even more exciting lately with a guaranteed 10 that you can have so much diversity within that group, and you can have so much of a broad spectrum of what movies can do and what they can be, because movies aren't just one thing, and they aren't one genre, and they aren't one group of people. So it's really exciting to kind of get big with what can be and what we can say this was the best of the year.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I actually watched District 9 for the first time semi-recently, and I was like, that's such a cool Best Picture nominee. Like, if we had never expanded, we'd never get that as a Best Picture nominee, and it's such a, like, distinct vision to nominate that. Which kind of brings me into the next question, which is, like, what is your awards philosophy? Like, are you sort of like a traditionalist in that it should just be solely based on merit? Do you think that narratives should sort of play into the awards? Like, how do you sort of view Best Picture, sort of the larger Oscar game, as they say?
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with that, I think. There are some movies that I really want to see succeed, even though they're not maybe the best indication of that filmmaker's work or that actor's work or something like that. But it's just like, it's time, it's ready. We need this right now. I always think of The Departed when I think of that. Like, it's not the best movie that was even that year. It's not even better than its original, but it's Martin Scorsese, and he has never won, and he's so deserving, and it's a pretty good movie. So, that's kind of how I feel about that. But I'm far more, I tend to lean more toward, let's pick a couple that are just great and like lavish everything on them and see where it goes from there. Um, because that's way more interesting, I think, is if you have a couple that are just like, these are the best. Now who's the best of the best?
Hmm. All right, I can get behind that. I like that philosophy. So before we get into some movies that you wanted to talk about, obviously, as I mentioned, you're going to be covering Best Picture in your Chasing the Gold column, and you have columns coming out every month. So I guess talk to me a little bit about maybe your read so far, or just how you've been approaching your column thus far. What kinds of things you might be looking forward to as we get into later on in the year.
I think as we get closer to the awards, it's obviously going to get much more narrow. Right now, I'm just kind of trying to do a broad idea, like let's talk about what's out and have fun with it, because a lot of the stuff that's out right now is not necessarily stuff that's going to make it to the end of the year, but it's kind of fun to think about. Like a Love Lives Bleeding would be fascinating to see in this conversation in a Best Picture uh, nominee, because it's so out there, but it has the DNA of so many films that have made it into that conversation. So my philosophy right now is let's throw some spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, see what's interesting to me, and then kind of get narrower as we get like more prestige pictures toward the end of the year.
That's interesting because Love Lies Bleeding is a movie that I typically would not watch if I have to be honest. And then a friend of mine wanted to see it, so I was like, I'll go with you. And then I ended up really enjoying it. So when you mentioned that it has sort of the DNA of other films that may have been in the conversation in the past, like expand on that because that's a really interesting
Yeah.
idea.
So it's kind of a body horror in a way. Like it's kind of got that element of, the I forget her name, but the main character played by Katie O'Brien is taking a lot of steroids to try and pump herself up. And so in her mind as well as in the movie, she kind of becomes this monstrous figure. And so I always think of like Shape of Water,
Mm,
or was that or even District 9, where they have an element of transformation to get you to a point of thinking about something in a different way. I also think of like Cronenberg when I think of Love Lies
mm,
Bleeding, because it's got a lot of those big ideas in this weird package. Same with like the Coen brothers. It's almost like a sort of a dark comedy in a way, like especially toward the end where a lot of bodies are falling, and you get that idea that like there's some humor behind this.
mm.
And I also find the DNA a little bit of like a Paul Thomas Anderson, where there's a lot of kooky characters stuck in one place trying to get out.
So you brought up a lot of films there that I love. And speaking of Shape of Water, I wanted us to each pick three Best Picture winners that are our favorites or just represent something in terms of how we view Best Picture. And that way it'll kind of guide our conversation and also give our listeners and viewers insight into how we view the big race. So one of my top three is The Shape of Water. I love this movie. I know that people, it's I don't know, controversial, weird, whatever, but I think it's a movie that means so much to me for a variety of personal reasons. I love how bold it is. I love how audacious it is. I love how just strikingly beautiful it is. I love that it's, I think, very representative of where we are in society and where we were when it won Best Picture and sort of the political landscape that we were in. I love that it's a movie that's so clearly personal to Guillermo del Toro, and I love that Academy voters were, honored his vision and were not afraid to give Best Picture to a movie where a woman f's a fish. Like it's just it's brilliant and it works as an allegory, it works as a film on its own. I would love to see more films like The Shape of Water win Best Picture, and I agree. I think, a lot of the times for us to see things clearly, we do have to see it through a non-traditional lens. Like there's nothing wrong with a straightforward, I don't know, something like Coda that wears its emotions on its sleeve and it tells you exactly what it is from beginning to end. But just having a film like The Shape of Water that stands out so much, and I really truly believe that it's a win that's going to age very well. So that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, uh, I tend to go toward the quieter
Mhm.
side of it. Um, two of my absolute favorites have the same ending in their title, so Spotlight and Moonlight are two of the most powerful ones from the last decade or so, where it's about something so much bigger, but it's done in such a way that it's a microcosm of that. Um, especially Spotlight, where you watch it and you see these reactions to the abuse scandals of the Catholic Church, and just in Boston, and in every scene where somebody's talking to somebody about uh, what they went through and how they've kind of tried to recover from it, you just see a church in the background and like how big it is and how menacing it is in their past and in the possible future of trying to litigate or trying to figure out how to move on from it. And then Moonlight uh, is just a beautiful story of trying to figure out who you are, uh, while also talking a lot about what it is to be different. And it's a hard challenge of a filmmaker to create that type of long breadth of film, because it takes it from childhood to adulthood, and also have a 3-act structure like it does. So like that's kind of where I come from, especially the last 10 years of filmmaking is that kind of movie.
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned earlier too, they're so representative of sort of the shift in like cinema and also just maybe the Academy and awards body sort of embracing these smaller films. Like I think in the 90s a film like Moonlight or and Spotlight probably would have been lost, you know.
Hmm.
Um
Yeah.
but no, that's beautifully said. My other two films, one is West Side Story, which it's just a movie that I can rewatch. And I did like the Spielberg remake, but I don't think it has the magic of the original. It's the film that made me fall in love with musical theater too.
Hmm.
Because I saw Cats when I was very young and I thought it was terrible, and I thought that all musical theater was Cats. And then I watched the West Side Story film and I was like, wait, like there's like so much more that I've been missing out on. And it's just colorful, and again, I think does a really good job of representing our society at the time and all of that stuff. And I think, I mean, I am a political nerd, and so I think the films that have a political sort of underpinning, however overt or otherwise, are always very interesting to me. And then the other film is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest,
Hmm.
because I'm a big bookworm. I think it's one of the best book to film adaptations. I think it's actually better than the book. I think Jack Nicholson, that's like an all-time great performance. I mean, the last 20 minutes, he barely utters a word, and there's so much being communicated. And it's, one of those films that won picture and actress and actor and screenplay. So it's just like a behemoth of a film that I also think has aged very well. And I think, to go to your earlier, that is one of those sort of quieter films, but it communicates so much. What's your third film?
Yeah, my third film goes back to the 50s. It's Marty. It's such a beautiful, like, slice of life, just really empathetic kind of movie, and it hits you in a weird way where, like, you think it's going to go somewhere completely different, and then has that beautiful ending and that really like wonderful cast, wonderful ideas behind it, and that stunning Patty Chayefsky script. Like it just hits all those moments, and kind of like it's a win for the little guy.
Mm. Yeah, I haven't seen it, so thank you for giving me homework that I'll know what to
Yeah.
do with the rest of my weekend. But it's interesting you mentioned empathy. Like I think that's a major theme of the three films you picked, and not to be cheesy, but like cinema in general, right? Is how
Hmm.
well it can communicate empathy through a film. So, Zach, this was your episode to design. So, what films did you bring for us to discuss today?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about at least the last two big picture Best Picture winners, which were Oppenheimer last year and the year before Everything Everywhere All at Once, because it's kind of almost signals a new trend in how the voting is going and how potentially it could affect um, movies down the line. Because these were two movies that were released far earlier in the year than are typical for a Best Picture winner or even a Best Picture nominee. And they were also films that kind of ran the gamut of like acting, technical, and filmmaking prowess in a different way than has been rewarded before. Because both of them kind of were nominated a ton of times with a bunch of different categories, but they also won a ton of categories, which hasn't been the trend of the last several years, especially after they started doing 10 Best Picture nominees or up to 10, depending on the year. And so, like, I wanted to talk a lot about those two because of seven each was their win total and kind of what that means for what's coming down the pipeline.
It's interesting because I think it's weird. I feel like Oppenheimer in particular kind of is a throwback to an old school Best Picture winner because you have like the big epic that people saw in theaters, like the auteur. I mean, it's kind of Titanic-esque, I guess. Like you
Mhm.
have this director that was long overdue. You have a Best Actor winner that was this beloved sort of indie actor for so long, finally getting his due in Hollywood. Then you have sort of RDJ and his whole veteran narrative. Culminating in this Oscar win. And then you have like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is the complete opposite of that. It was the kind of like
Yeah,
the wonder kids that burst on the scene uh and were able to win this big prize. So I don't know, they kind of represent a little bit of both. And I do think I completely agree with you that we're seeing a shift. But I think also seeing Oppenheimer dominate the way that it did this year does kind of make me think like I think we're in a phase of the Academy where it's kind of like the battle between the old and the new. Like I think
mhm.
and a film like Oppenheimer, I think very much appeals to both like the steak eaters of the Academy, the old school Academy sensibilities, as well as maybe the younger, more international audience. But I think we're very much in a transition period. And I think a lot of the films and races that we'll talk about today show that.
Yeah, and even what you were talking about of the younger group probably were the spearhead of the Everything Everywhere All at Once campaign, as well as that more international feature, because it is a Chinese American story, but that also connects to a bigger world story of immigrants and of kind of family dynamics in a new space. And Oppenheimer, you're right, is really much a throwback, but from a director who's been championed by kind of the new guard of Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How much do you think? I mean, I think both films do have I would maybe political, maybe not political in a traditional sense, but there is sort of like a message and an underpinning. I mean, how much do you think that contributed to the win? Did you feel like maybe they felt like we, have I don't know how to word like but you know what I mean? I wonder if those
Yes.
messages sort of not that they felt like they had to award it, but if those messages sort of made them feel better about voting for this film that they obviously very much liked.
Yeah, and I do think that's true, especially with Oppenheimer and especially where we are in terms of world politics at this point. And uh, it seems like it's a movie that needed to be talked about because of how much Oppenheimer was for nuclear kind of science, and then once it's used, he's against it. And so, like, how we can kind of change our minds about a certain thing once we realize what it can do. Uh, it's very much how we're talking about certain things today. And I think especially with everything everywhere all at once, more than anything, that was a statement about parenting. It,
Mm.
how our shifting narratives toward um, saying, not just saying, here's your participation trophy, you're wonderful, you do a great job, but saying, I may not understand you, but I love you. And that kind of hopeful political shift or hopeful human shift toward more acceptance of everyone that lives and not just acceptance of the people who fit in the mainstream.
Yeah, and I think both films weirdly sort of bridge the gap between like our parents' generation and our generation, right? Of
For
like,
sure.
these are what you did in the past. This is how it affects us now, both in the case of nuclear war and all of that stuff. And sort of like, I always think of Oppenheimer in terms of like, here's this man with a massive ego, but it's also showing us like the consequences of that.
Hmm.
And then in terms of Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think, when I first saw it, I thought, okay, it's I should say when the conversation started to really pick up and it became a possibility, I really didn't think that it was gonna have, it was gonna win because I just thought people are gonna think it's too weird. Like I just didn't
Right.
and I didn't think that older audiences would connect. I thought that the jumping back and forth was going to be too much. And I did, to be honest, like I heard a lot of that in my own personal life where maybe older audiences did not connect to it. So there was a part of me that was like, I don't know if this is going to pull through. But I think what I did hear over and over again is like people were like, oh, this reminds me of my relationship with my mom. This reminds me of my relationship with my dad. And then you had, immigrant, like there was just so many the human side of things that people could really relate to, right?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So where do you think sort of, as you mentioned, this sort of being indicative of where we might be headed? I mean, what do you think that this could maybe represent for the future? I certainly think and to bring in like Moonlight as well and The Shape of Water, like more um personal stories. I mean, again with Coda, like I think that that's becoming more and more evident, I think.
Very true. Yeah. I think it's more of like we had that spate of directors that were directing like very personal stories for a long. We had Roma, we had Belfast, we had The Fablemans, where like directors were kind of telling their own story in a certain way, and more than that, like Everything Everywhere or Oppenheimer is more of they're putting themselves within a broader picture. And I think that the trend is far more toward let's give a lot of love to a few things rather than what we used to do, which was give everybody something.
Mhm.
You think back to like 2019, where pretty much every Best Picture winner, except for The Irishman, got something like they were nominated for, or 2018, 2017, things like that. But like 2022, 2023, we're seeing a real like compression of what we're kind of doing, and so we're seeing like a real like cheerleader squad behind a smaller group, even though we have that large group. And I think that,
So
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
well, do you think that that's indicative of a change of taste, or do you think that's indicative of there's so much content being thrown at everyone, including awards voters, and they're not having a chance to watch things enabled in order to be able to spread the wealth?
That's a good question. I don't think that it's that necessarily. I think that we've always wanted to have one big one. You know what I
Mm,
mean? I think that we've liked that in the past. I think you go back to 2003 with Return of the King winning 11 awards. That seems like daunting and crazy because you see Blu-ray packages with 1, 2 Academy Awards kind of thing now, and you're like, wow, they got two. But I think that we want like because more than anything, like you can win Best Picture like Moonlight did and get a handful of other awards, but when you win 7, 8, 9 awards, then you're actually saying this is the Best Picture because it also has great acting, it also has fantastic editing, it also has a good script. You're kind of coalescing behind something and making it mean more than like uh, I don't want to bash anything, but Green Book, like that one won a few awards, but at the same time, it also was like picking and choosing the awards that it won, rather than saying this is Best Picture because everything else with it is also the best.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's something that, as you were, speaking, like what stood out to me is thinking about. I think we're very much in a place in society where we want something to root for, which is why, especially like the narrative of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, it was just, they were infectious. They were everywhere together. You could see the camaraderie between the
Mm.
cast. I mean, having somebody like Michelle Yeoh, who I spent my entire life thinking that she had been nominated for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And so, like, the fact that this iconic actress was finally getting her moment, was really beautiful to see. And KK Kwan coming back, sort of this classic Hollywood narrative of like the child actor who grows into this beloved leading man and gives this incredible performance. And again, with Coda, I think very much, and even with Oppenheimer, I mean, I think there is, again, seeing this beloved director who, speaking of the expansion of Best Picture, very much could be, the Dark Knight, we could argue,
Hmm.
was responsible for that, right? So, like,
Yeah,
seeing him kind of have his moment in the sun finally. So I think we do kind of want something to cheer for, and that's kind of been the trend, maybe more than anything else, is like, what can we coalesce behind and sort of pat ourselves on the back of, like, we picked a really good. I mean, even Green Book, as controversial as it was, I think they voted for it because ultimately it was a movie that made them feel good when they
right.
finished watching it.
Yeah, it certainly harkens back to a lot of classic filmmaking. Like it's got a lot of the elements that um, we see in a lot of previous winners and a lot of previous nominees, where like it's just got that spark. Like people want to go see it, they want to talk about it, whether positive or negative, and kind of that was the trend of it more so than Roma, which is a beautiful movie, but it kind of polarizes people, especially its ending and its kind of not real conclusive ending, so to speak. So
Well,
like, yeah.
let's touch on this, because there's a few movies that I think we are in this sort of trend of these sort of classic filmmakers that have made these highly personal films that are big epics. I mean, you mentioned The Irishman, Killers of the Flower Moon, um, Roma, Belfast. What was the one I'm blanking? Oh, The Fablemans, right? And so
Mhm.
I think when we're earlier in this seasons, we're thinking, okay, this is it. This beloved filmmaker has made this highly personal epic, and it's going to sweep in a traditional sense, and that really has not come to pass at all.
Mhm.
So, what do you think is happening there? Where is there a disconnect? What's going on?
I think the discourse is playing a lot into it. Like our social media lives play a heck of a lot more into this process than actually like sitting down and thinking about the movie, because so many of these people who can't go to every movie or who can't like have time to sit down and really go through them, they're focusing on what people are talking about and what people are saying about something. So if they hear a lot of negativity or if they hear a lot of positivity, they might start to move toward that end, and they might, watch an interview or think about a news article that they saw that somebody reposted, or that kind of thing. So I think a lot of it is building toward what people are talking about more than what people are watching,
Hmm.
and it changes Like, especially with The Fablemans, it's a wonderful movie for a lot of reasons, but at the same time, it's a Spielberg movie without the Spielberg panache. You know, it doesn't have the incredible set pieces that people expect from a Spielberg movie. It doesn't have the incredible like uh, wonderment in the same way that a lot of people want from a Spielberg movie. Same with Belfast. You know, Kenneth Branagh, as a journeyman filmmaker, has done some really interesting movies. You know, say what you will about the Agatha Christie ones that he's been doing, but like those get butts in the seats, and they are fascinating adaptations, as well as like he's done a superhero movie. He did Thor, and so people wanted from Belfast something a little bit different, I think, than what they got, and what they got was something super personal and super kind of polarizing, because it didn't do this or it didn't do that. Even though he's doing a story that's small, they wanted it to be a story that's big. It's got to be all about the Irish Troubles. It's got to be all about
Mm.
what this guy was doing at this time, this historical figure, and what this historical figure was doing, not just about this kid and his family. And so I think that that's where, even though they love to say, yeah, let's put it in Best Picture, they don't want to be like, that's not the Best Picture, though, is it? That kind of thing.
That's fascinating, and now I'm like, what? I need to pick your brain about a gazillion other things, which brings me to Scorsese, because he
Yeah.
has been racking up the nominations, but not getting the wins. Which, particularly, I have to be honest, The Irishman I did not connect to. So when that movie did not do well, I was like, I can understand why. I mean, it was polarizing, it was difficult to sit through at times. But then you look at Killers of the Flower Moon, which on paper has everything that a big Oscar juggernaut, in terms of wins, not just nominations, which it got. I mean, you have DiCaprio, you have De Niro coming back in a phenomenal performance, the Lily Gladstone of it all, which I will touch on, but like a beloved book that's been adapted, this sort of classic American story. And then you have sort of Scorsese commenting on sort of what and his narrative as a filmmaker, of like, how are we shaping the stories that we tell, is a really fascinating, truly like epic, in an epic sense of the word, film. And yet it didn't translate. And even with Lily Gladstone and the incredible performance that she gave, the incredible energy and narrative behind her, it wasn't enough to translate to a win there. I'm not really sure what that disconnect is. I'm really fascinated by it, because you have sort of one of our most beloved filmmakers in one of the most fascinating eras of his career, and it's not connecting.
Yeah. And I don't even know if it's Scorsese himself that they're not connecting with, or the material he's choosing, or the way in which he chooses to do it. Because his producing partners now are people that are like, here's $150 million, we're hands off. And so I wonder if it's a sense of people think that it's overreach, especially with like The Irishman, where it's a 3 hour Netflix movie, right? And people are like, is this too much of this? Should he have edited it down? Should he have, done something else with it? The CGI de-aging of it all, has that affected how people saw it? And with Killers of the Flower Moon, I think you're hitting it on all cylinders. It's a hugely American story, but maybe people thought of it as, well, we don't want to alienate anybody who thinks at this time that history is being changed in some way. Even though this is historical fact, they're like, well, the white people are evil. So we don't really want to like kick that beehive right now. And I almost wonder if it's a step back in terms of not pushing forward with something that's a really important story and a really important era of history, and something that still goes on in small ways with Americans and our indigenous population. Here in Washington, we hear it all the time about, oh, well, the Native Americans have it great because they have casinos now, or because they have certain rights or certain things. And it's
Mm,
like, well, step back. Let's think about this in a bigger perspective. And I think that's what Scorsese tried to do. And maybe some people at the same time were thinking, it's 3.5 hours. Shouldn't it have been a miniseries? Or,
mm,
that's kind of where people are shifting their attentions to, it seems, is miniseries or limited series. And so they don't always see this coherent story that he created as something that's worthy of, this small group. Um, I lost my train of thought there for a second.
No, I will. We'll come back to that because you touched on an interesting point, but it also brings us to where we are this season because we have Francis Ford Coppola. Is it? I don't know. Is it Megapolis? Is
I
that
think it's Megapolis. I think so.
Megapolis?
I've never heard it
So
spoken aloud, but that's how I
yeah,
assume.
yeah. Okay, well, that's what we're gonna go with and see where the rest of the season takes us. But I mean, that's premiered at Cannes, a very long film. It kind of has this making all the makings of what we're talking about now, right? Like, do you think
Mm.
that that's gonna be another film that's gonna sort of fall into this category of like the deeply personal epic that doesn't really go very far?
Yeah, I think it's not going to resonate at all. It could find an audience. It could find some like really staunch defenders and like people that are going for it. But I think at the same time, Coppola hasn't had the uh, filmography that Scorsese has. He hasn't had the goodwill for as long as Scorsese had. People view Coppola as the Godfather, and they don't really think of him as anything else. And so, like, his films of the last 2 decades have just been, you know, released and forgotten. And so, I think with that, he's definitely going to get a lot of the people talking. He's going to get a lot of people, wondering about his methods and wondering about, uh, if they should, if they could, if they dare to kind of bring it into the conversation. But I think it's unless it finds distribution or unless it finds a way to get out of the negative narrative that it's already got going for it, it's probably just gonna fade away like the rest of his stuff, unfortunately.
Mm. Which brings me to sort of your previous point, which two things that you touched on, which I'm again very fascinated by narratives, and I'm sort of curious how you think, we are in this sort of streaming era, Apple, Netflix giving these filmmakers massive budgets to do with as they please, which I completely agree with you. I think has led to part of the backlash. A, because maybe voters don't want to support the streamer as much, and B, because I think you're right that maybe leaning into your vision too much is not a good idea. And then I think the second trend that we've seen is sort of the superhero film, which hasn't really
Mhm.
been embraced, right? And then even something like Barbie, as good as it was, I think the fact that it was based on this previous IP and the fact that it was based on a doll and a variety of other reasons makes it difficult for people to take it as seriously and makes it difficult for people to see it as an awards type movie. And so like I think, and to tie it into our earlier conversation, while we do have sort of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once winning best picture, we're still dealing with perhaps traditional ideas, maybe not. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I do agree with you that they weren't ready for Barbie. Like
Mm.
Barbie is in its own world. If they're in session readers watching this right now, they know that it was my number one movie of last year because I loved everything about it. But I think too, we have to also look at the directors branch for that too, because if you can't find a way to diversify that group, we're not going to be able to find a way out of this mold of traditional stories. Uh,
Mm.
like this year, it was wonderful to see, and I'm probably going to butcher her name, so I apologize, Justine Triet in that director's category. But like there could have been somebody else, like a Celine Song or a Greta Gerwig. also in there, or even Cord Jefferson popping
Mhm.
up in there. But I think that that group is such a tight knit, closed off kind of a group that it's never going to push Best Picture beyond what people expect. Um, you get the wonderful outliers or the wonderful kind of momentum and progress, like seeing Jane Campion back up there for Power of the Dog. You get to see Chloe Zhao for Nomadland. You get to see, before that, gosh, why am I blanking on her name? Hurt Locker.
Oh,
Catherine Bigelow.
Catherine Bigelow, yeah.
Yeah, you get to see her like, and the funny part of her narrative is she beat her ex-husband for that award. But unless like that becomes far more common, I think what you're talking about of this traditional idea is going to stay stagnant, and it's going to like we'll feel free to nominate up to 10 and up to interesting movies, but we'll stick to our guns where it counts, which is the win.
Mhm.
And so until we kind of get over that hump, it's going to be tough to
Yeah, I
move on.
think that's a big part of the problem is they sort of pat themselves on the back for the nomination, right? Or they're like, "Well,
Mhm.
we awarded, 2 women best director back to back, so we're done for a while." I hope I'm wrong, but I feel like
I
that's
really
very
hope it's
much
wrong too. Yeah.
yeah. But I think that that's very much what happens. Which brings me to something I know you wanted to discuss, which is like the best director, best picture split, which is also
Yeah.
really fascinating because I feel like a lot of times we'll be like, well, we'll award this visionary Jane Campion to your point, right? Like we award your vision, we award your body of work, but we're not going to give it the big prize, like
Mhm.
it's almost like best director perhaps has become a bit of a consolation prize for not winning best picture.
Yeah, it definitely feels like that. And you kind of go back to Moonlight versus La La Land as well, where um, forget his name, but the
Damien
director
Chazelle.
Damien Chazelle, where he won director, and then with that kind of flub at the end there, where they're saying La La Land. Well, it almost is a technical award at this point with director. It almost is like we're going to find the guy that did the most and we're going to give it to him, because you also see that with a lot of the mid kind of 2010s as well, where Inarritu, I mean that didn't split, but Birdman, then The Revenant, and then Cuarón with Gravity, and then Roma, and you kind of like you see this idea that they kind of have in their heads of what a director is, whereas what we see a director as is a person who has vision and aptitude, but also you know created something worthy of being in the same sentence as it, and that's just something that they don't do all the time. Like you've mentioned Coda and Power of the Dog, that's a strange mix to have, but you have the body of work of Jane Campion versus the crowd pleaser of a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Her movie is I love it, but it's somewhat hard to like. um, you've got a lot going toward um, a connection again, like the Daniels one for Everything Everywhere All at Once, and Christopher Nolan one for Oppenheimer, and Chloe Zhao one for Nomadland. So like they're kind of connecting at some point, but it seems to be still they're of two minds about who does what more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's why, hopefully I'm wrong, but probably why Scorsese will never win again, because he is such a force of his own movies that they can't separate his direction from the actual picture. And so they will never kind of diverge. But somebody like Damien Chazelle, who you can kind of see his fingerprints on everything, but not a cohesive, like, this is his own work versus this is a work we need to reward.
That's fascinating. I've never thought about that before. You're like opening up my mind to new possibility. No, I'm like, yeah. So another thing too, as I sort of like I'm looking through the list of films that you sent me, but we have seen an increase in international voters coming into the Academy, which has translated to a lot of foreign films making it into Best Picture.
Yeah.
Obviously Parasite winning a couple years ago. So, where do you see that fitting into the larger narrative of Best Picture moving forward, and particularly, audiences and their taste? I think it's great that people are embracing these films.
Yeah, and I do think that it kind of goes back to Bong Joon-ho's one of his quotes where he said, if Americans can get over that 2-inch space, they're going to open their eyes to a whole new world of cinema. And I think that opening up the Academy membership to far more international folks, besides Brits and Australians, and getting them to see far more unique and interesting visions. Like we wouldn't, if Parasite hadn't, soared, we wouldn't have had the wonderfulness of Anatomy of a Fall, like challenging those narratives and challenging what people like to watch at the movies. Um, and I think too, with the way cinema is experienced now more on streaming than in a traditional theater, it opens up far more avenues toward, what a firm like Netflix can promote. They can say, look, this is the number one movie on our site right now, and it's from Bangladesh. And
Mm.
so they can kind of manipulate that, what we watch and what we think about movies, into a more unique experience rather than just the superheroes or just the IP driven stuff. And I think that having Parasite win Best Picture and Director and Script, having Anatomy of Fall win Script, having Zone of Interest win Best Sound was fascinating to see how we can expand the idea of what this awards body can do to promote film and to actually like cultivate a more unique experience for the world culture.
Mm. So I guess I want to talk about where we think we see this race going next. As I mentioned, I think we are very much in a space where the academy is changing, but it's also grappling with that change, which is why I think they keep going again back and forth between the traditional and what is sort of creative and different and fun and exciting. It's kind of almost, it's like one for you and one for us type of a situation. And I think eventually Netflix or perhaps another streamer is going to break the barrier, and we are going to see more streaming films break through. I think what Apple was very smart, I think sort of them picking up a film at a festival rather than maybe branding it from the beginning as a streaming film is a perhaps a very smart strategy, and then focusing on like the narrative of, well, this isn't an Apple, this is a tiny film, like the tiny engine that could type film. So I think like with the right campaign, Netflix can sort of maybe rebrand itself. It's trying to do that. It's trying to be like, well, look at
Mhm.
all the indie filmmakers that we're supporting, right? So I think maybe if it leans more into that side of things. But yeah, I think what I'm just most interested in looking in terms of Best Picture is like, how is this changing membership? How, to your point, like audience change, like audience taste changing of people, not wanting to go to theaters as much, focusing, TV sort of the TVization of cinema in some ways, right?
Mhm.
So like how does that play into what's going to win? And then sort of the preferential ballot and having voters rank their choices. Is that something that they're going to stay with? How does that maybe punish films that sort of get stuck in the middle? You know what I mean? So sort of what kinds of things are you maybe watching for? What predictions do you think as we look at maybe the next decade?
I think a really good bellwether for where kind of this academy can go for the next 5 years or so is Yorgos Lanthimos' next movie, because it's a return to form for him of these like dark nihilistic kinds of things that he was doing before he became this hugely lauded filmmaker with The Favorite and Poor Things. And so, if that can break through, we may be seeing like a shift into um, a more uh, broad spectrum of viewers. And I think too, with that, we also are seeing far more things out of Cannes kind of making the rounds and making the ideas known than we are seeing stuff out of Toronto or out of kind of the fall festivals. And so it's one to pay attention to. Like it used to be one to just be like, oh, that's kind of fun. That sounds like a weird fun movie. But Parasite won the Palme d'Or, and Anatomy of a Fall won. I think also the Palme d'Or, maybe the Camera d'Or. And
No,
so
yeah, it won the Polish.
thank you. And
Mhm.
so like there's all kinds of stuff where you have to see what the summer is like before you can even touch the fall, because we were so excited about the Iron Claw last year and Ferrari last year, and nothing came out of
Mm.
those. Even though those were prime Oscar movies, they had all the bells and whistles of every single, what you would think of as an Oscar movie, but didn't hit. Just stayed below the radar. So I think that's where we are, is we're seeing where the trends are in the summer, and then we're
Mm.
kind of moving on from there. And any prediction I have is usually going to come out of the summer, I think.
Yeah. Well, okay, so it's interesting you mentioned that. We're recording this on the 25th, and today all the Cannes winners were announced. And speaking of Yorgos Lanthimos, Jesse Plemons took Best Actor for Kinds of Kindness. And particularly Yorgos has a very good track record with actors at the Oscars. So
Mhm.
I'm really fascinated to see where that goes. And I think, speaking of the Academy going international, I mean, they're going increasingly European. I mean, the BAFTA sort of block does a lot to sort of push through. We see a lot of European-esque films do very, I mean, they've always done very well. I'm not saying this is a surprise, but I just think, again, with sort of Emma winning over Lily,
Right.
Olivia Colman winning for The Favorite, like we just the Zone of Interest doing very well. So I think that that's going to be something that I'm looking forward to, is like, is the internationalness going to continue to lean more European, or are we going to see, perhaps other countries? We've seen some breakthrough with Asian cinema, but are there other parts of the world that can finally, African cinema, are there other parts of the world that can finally sort of become part of the conversation, or is our sort of international list going to continue to lean white, for lack of a better.
No. Well, and I agree with you. I think that it definitely leans toward the European for now.
Mm,
And I think with the inclusion of RRR in the previous years, kind of speaking about like any sort of like buzz and then it winning song,
mm,
was a coup in a way, because like Bollywood never breaks into Hollywood. And I think that's an interesting idea, is if we could see like these other groups, like maybe South America. We've already got Inarritu and Del Toro and Cuaron kind of doing that, Central America, but like it'd be interesting if we could see the South American filmmakers really break in, and it would be like they have the power over in Nigeria and Nollywood to
mm,
really kind of break into this thing. And I think too, it would have to be very small film that got nominated for international features. If you ever saw Il Capitano, I think it was called, but it was a co-production with Italy and an African country, and I think
mm,
that that's how they can kind of bridge that gap, is if they kind of get Europe's money involved in kind of some of these Southern Hemisphere groups, because they could really do something wonderful. They've got phenomenal filmmakers down there that could really do something wonderful with some of that cash.
That's so speaking of cash, so you mentioned sort of looking to the summer, and I agree with you, obviously. I think our awards calendar is much earlier now than it was in years past, but I'm also really fascinated by what's going on in the box office right now with just people not showing up.
Mhm.
So how much of a part of the narrative do you think the box office plays or will continue to play? And sort of, I mean, you mentioned we haven't had very many players, I guess, but like, do you think that Furiosa, for example, underperforming, quote unquote, does that mean that it's like out of the conversation? I mean, where do you think that sort of?
It's hard to say because this is a unique year in that we had that prolonged writers and actors strike last year, and
Mhm.
that shifted a couple of different movies. It shifted Dune, it shifted Challengers, and so it kind of uh, upended what people thought would be the summer kind of narrative. Without a Marvel summer, where do we even think about our box office? We don't have a Barbenheimer this year to really kind
Mm,
of count on. And I don't know that money always plays a huge factor in Best Picture, especially. I mean, you think back to 2009 with the competition between The Hurt Locker being a $9 million box office versus Avatar, which was $1 billion box office. There's all kinds of ideas of it's not about the money, it's about the passion. And so I think if somebody can get behind Furiosa and really pound home how much they like it or how much it changes the ideas of the post-apocalyptic genre, or kind of get behind Anya Taylor-Joy as a serious Best Actress candidate, it's going to change that narrative from, oh, it's not as good as Fury Road was in 2015, that kind of
mm.
thing.
Yeah,
But
I'm
it's
always.
another. Well, I was just going to say it's another thing of like maybe it's also sequel fatigue or
Mm,
spin-off fatigue. And so, people are like, yeah, it's another Mad Max. I can see it or I can not. I don't really have to decide right now this
mm.
opening weekend.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated kind of going back to the idea of narratives, sort of picking and choosing what narrative you're going to play into. Because I agree. I mean, obviously, box office has not played very much into Best Picture winners in recent years. But then with Oppenheimer and Everything Everywhere All at Once, it was very clear that these films making money made their campaign people very happy, and that was something. It was like, look, people showed up for this, and so therefore that's another reason why it should be part of the conversation. And particularly with Oppenheimer, I mean, it did feel like, look, we're celebrating cinema, we're celebrating a hit, we're celebrating this sort of crowd pleaser thing that people showed up for. I mean, it's not a crowd pleaser in a traditional sense, but
Yeah.
it did make, I mean, people, it got butts in seats, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's really interesting to see, like, but then you have something like Blade Runner 2049 where they were like, oh, look at this like artistic endeavor that maybe, and it was sort of like almost a badge of honor of like, well, it didn't connect maybe the way that it should have, but that's just because it was brilliant, and it was, I don't know, I'm always fascinated by how these people craft their narratives.
Yeah.
Zach, w- are there maybe films or races that we haven't touched on that you want to chat about before we?
Yeah, well, I will say a future column is definitely going to be dedicated to a really small indie that I got to see here in Seattle at the Seattle International Film Festival. It's called Ghostlight, again, light.
Oh.
Um, it was a supremely beautiful film, and I um, can't wait to actually like have people see it because it's one that like we here in Seattle are a little frosty when it comes to movies, and so sometimes even when the filmmakers are there, we just kind of oh that's nice. But this one got a genuine like standing ovation from the crowd, and so like it's one that I really want people to see and really want people to
Mm,
talk about. Like just talk it up, talk it up, talk it up, because if more people talk about it, I think that gets more butts in the seats and eyes on it. And the filmmakers did say that they are going to start small like usual, but eventually expand to bigger audiences. So they're hopefully getting a wide release at some point. I think it's through IFC. But yeah, I'm hoping for a lot of people to see it and love it as much as I do.
Yeah, speaking of a film that's out this weekend that I hope people see, I haven't seen Furiosa yet. What I did get to see was Hitman at TIFF last year. So I have to shout out
Yeah.
my fellow Histonian Richard Linklater. I'm just such a huge fan of his, as I've mentioned 1,000 times on this podcast. And if you live near a draft house or an indie cinema that is showing Hitman, I hope you got to see it, because I think seeing it with the crowd is the right way to see it. And to be quite honest, I was disappointed when Netflix bought it, because I wanted it to have a traditional theatrical release. And speaking of sort of TV and prestige TV, I have been obsessed with The Curse. I don't know if you've seen. It's a difficult show to recommend because it's so weird, and I think it's not a lot of people's sensibility, and I completely understand why, but it is so out there. And I really like Nathan Fielder's brain and the way that he approaches filmmaking and just is not afraid to do something weird. And I mean, if you've liked Uncut Gems, or if the Safdie brothers sensibility is something you enjoy, I think The Curse is really interesting. And Nathan Fielder just announced that he's going to be making his directorial debut with Emma Stone for A24. So whatever that movie is going to be, I'm super excited about. But those are some things that I've been sort of nerding out about this past week-ish. Did you have anything else, Zach, that you wanted to mention?
I'm a huge X-Men fan. So if you like the X-Men, I can't recommend X-Men 97 enough. It definitely, I thought at first that it was just going to be like, it's a nostalgia trip. I loved the show when I was a kid. That's going to be great. But they delved so deeply into the mythos of these characters and deeply into the ideas behind what makes them tick and their metaphors, and just created something utterly gorgeous that I can't recommend highly enough. And like I saw a headline. I'm not much of a TV follower, but I saw a headline about an Emmys post, and they were like X-Men 97 for best drama, and I was like, what if it could do it, because it's so good. So that's one thing that I've been an evangelist for a long time. I'm a big comics fan, so like seeing that, I was like, oh god, I hope they don't screw up the movies now that they're gonna do them.
No, it's so funny. I think I have very much reached a level of superhero fatigue in particular, but X-Men 97, I'm gonna get to it. I don't know when, but it's gonna happen. And it's one of those things where I always think about the divide between like what we film TV nerds are talking about and what sort of quote unquote regular non-obsessive film and TV watchers are talking about and thinking about. And that's a show that like everyone in my life, regardless of what level of geekness they have, love it. So I think that's always a good barometer too, is like if it gets like the normies quote unquote talking about it, it must be good.
Yeah.
Zach, where can our listeners and viewers find you on social media? Where can they find your work?
Yeah, well, I'm not a social media person, but if you wanted to see just kind of star ratings of stuff I'm watching, I'm on Letterboxd. It's just my first initial and my last name, and the number is 108. So Z Youngs 108. I can't guarantee a follow back, but you'll get to see what I'm doing. And all my writing is on In Session. I haven't branched out very much. So, and then if you like fiction, I have some self-published novels on Amazon. So feel free to jump in on that. Two of them are like the same character that I've been writing for a long time, and then the most recent one is one that I did like this serialized story on a blog that I had for 3 years or something like that, and I finally compiled it into one thing, and it's got everything. It's got mermaids and werewolves and vampires and zombies and all kinds of crazy stuff. So I'd love if more people read it.
Zach, you listened to me tell you multiple times during this podcast that I'm a massive book nerd, and you failed to mention that you write books.
Yeah.
Can you send me a link, please?
Yes,
I will
absolutely.
Yeah, I will order immediately. That is so exciting. Oh my gosh. Now I hope people are actually watching this because I feel like my face has lit up and now my Memorial Day weekend plans have been made for me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I am at Shadan Larkey everywhere, in session film around the web as well. But I do want to say, please write a review for us, rate us, tell your friends and family to watch the show, listen to the show. I think that the Chasing the Gold, what we're doing this year, is so exciting. We have so many different perspectives. I love getting to see, what people pick for their columns and sort of how they take their categories and branch it off into really interesting, weird things. And it's such a privilege to get to edit and oversee it all. And I really hope that you guys will give us your eyeballs and listen to this podcast. Thank you so much for Zach for joining me and geeking out with me about Best Picture. It was so fun. And I loved getting to hear your perspective. You sort of, again, branched. I don't know. There's just so many things that I hadn't considered before. So it's a joy to get to do this with you. So thank you so much for
Absolutely.
your time.
A lot of fun.
And we'll catch you on the next one, guys. Thank you so much for listening.